The rain in Seattle always had a way of masking the sounds of breaking things. At 2 a.m., the only illumination in the sprawling Bellevue living room came from the cold, sterile glow of Evelyn's silver MacBook. Daniel Foster had only opened it to find their daughter's tuition receipt for Lakeside School. Instead, an auto-filled password unlocked a hidden, encrypted email account. The messages weren't just romantic. They were visceral, illicit, and deeply terrifying. As Daniel read the words his wife of 7 years had typed to a man named Julian, his perfect world quietly shattered into a million jagged pieces. He expected betrayal, but as his eyes scanned the attachments, he realized this wasn't just an affair, it was a hostage situation. If stories of hidden sins, complex betrayals, and the devastating price of truth speak to you, settle in, lower the lights, and stay with me. This is a journey into the darkest corners of a marriage. The heavy Seattle rain lashed against the floor-to-ceiling windows of the Foster residence, sounding like handfuls of gravel thrown against the glass. It was 2:14 a.m. The house was submerged in the profound, suffocating silence that only exists in the dead of night, broken only by the rhythmic hum of the central heating and the soft, staccato clicking of a keyboard. Daniel Foster sat at the kitchen island, the cold granite seeping through the sleeves of his cotton robe. He rubbed his tired eyes, the blue light from Evelyn's silver MacBook casting harsh shadows across his face. He hadn't intended to pry. He was a man of logic, a senior director at Pemberton Tech who dealt in algorithms and predictable outcomes. He only needed the tax identification number from Lakeside School for their accountant, a mundane task for a Tuesday night. But Evelyn had left her laptop open, resting in sleep mode. When Daniel tapped the trackpad, the browser hadn't opened to her usual art curation blogs or the school's portal. It opened to an incognito window, an email client, e.brooks.private@proton.me. Daniel frowned. Evelyn's maiden name. She hadn't used Brooks in 7 years. He told himself to close it, to respect the boundary. But a red notification bubble glared at him from the corner of the screen. 3 new messages. The sender was listed simply as Jai. Daniel's finger hovered over the trackpad. His heart, previously beating at a slow, resting pace, executed a hard, violent thump against his ribs. He clicked. The inbox loaded, displaying a thread that stretched back for 8 agonizing months. 8 months of a parallel universe he had been entirely blind to. Daniel opened the most recent message, time-stamped just 3 hours ago, while he had been upstairs reading a bedtime story to their daughter. Jay, the dress you wore tonight was exquisite, but I prefer you the way you were in my apartment yesterday afternoon. Don't forget our arrangement, Evie. I'm not a patient man. The breath left Daniel's lungs in a sudden, painful rush. It felt as though the atmospheric pressure in the kitchen had violently dropped. Evie, only her father called her that. And now this stranger, this Jay. His trembling hand scrolled down, venturing deeper into the digital abyss. The emails weren't just passing flirtations. They were explicit, detailed chronologies of stolen afternoons at a place referred to as the Meridian. They spoke of intertwined limbs, of whispered promises, of a desperate, consuming heat that Daniel hadn't felt from his wife in years. But there was something else woven through the prose, a dark, metallic thread of urgency. Evelyn. I can't do tomorrow. Daniel is working from home. Please, Julian. You promised you would give me a few days. Julian. You don't make the schedule anymore, my love. 2 p.m. or I make the call to Pemberton Tech. Your choice. Daniel froze. The chill of the granite countertop seemed to seep directly into his bones. He read the lines again, his analytical mind struggling to process the conflicting data. The betrayal of the flesh was a sharp, burning agony in his chest, but the mention of his company, of Pemberton Tech, was a bucket of ice water over his head. He stared at the screen until the words blurred into meaningless gray lines. Upstairs, he heard the faint creak of the floorboards. Evelyn was turning over in her sleep, wrapped in the expensive Italian sheets of their shared bed, dreaming whatever dreams a woman with a secret life dreamed. Daniel slowly closed the laptop. The sudden darkness in the kitchen was absolute. He sat there in the silence, listening to the rain, knowing with terrifying certainty that the life he had built, the marriage he had trusted, was already dead. He just hadn't attended the funeral yet. The morning sun breached the Seattle skyline, casting long, pale rays through the kitchen windows and illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air. Daniel sat in the exact same spot at the granite island, nursing a mug of black coffee that had gone cold an hour ago. He hadn't slept. Every time he closed his eyes, the glowing words from the screen burned against the back of his eyelids like a brand. Evelyn walked into the kitchen at exactly 6:30 a.m., a symphony of practiced elegance. She wore her silk robe, her dark hair perfectly brushed, smelling faintly of expensive jasmine lotion and the mild roast coffee she always brewed. To anyone else, she was the picture of a devoted mother and a successful art curator preparing for her day. But to Daniel, looking at her through the newly shattered lens of his reality, she was a stranger, a beautifully constructed lie. "Morning," she murmured, brushing a light kiss against his temple. The contact made his stomach churn. He forced himself not to flinch, his fingers gripping the ceramic mug so tightly his knuckles turned white. "Morning," he replied, his voice sounding hollow, an empty echo in a cavernous room. As she moved gracefully around the kitchen, preparing their daughter's lunchbox, Daniel's mind violently drifted back to the origin of this nightmare. He remembered the charity gala at the Seattle Art Museum 8 months ago. He had been there, standing right next to her, holding a glass of champagne, when Julian St. James first entered their orbit. Julian was a predator cloaked in bespoke Italian wool. He possessed the kind of effortless wealth that made the room tilt on its axis when he walked in. Evelyn had curated the contemporary exhibit, and Julian, a prolific real estate developer, had purchased the centerpiece, a striking, chaotic, abstract piece, without even asking the price. Daniel remembered the way Julian had looked at Evelyn that night. It wasn't just admiration for her artistic eye, it was an appraisal. He had complimented her intellect, her vision, bypassing Daniel entirely with a polite but dismissive nod. Evelyn had flushed, a subtle rosy warmth spreading across her collarbones. At the time, Daniel had felt a flicker of pride that this powerful man was captivated by his brilliant wife. Now the memory tasted like ash. That flush hadn't been professional pride. It had been the first spark of a devastating fire. "Are you all right, Dan?" Evelyn's voice snapped him back to the present. She was looking at him, her brow furrowed in that familiar, endearing way of hers. "You look pale. Did you sleep at all?" The sheer audacity of her concern paralyzed him. He wanted to scream. He wanted to drag her by the wrist to the laptop and force her to read the digital filth she had exchanged in the dead of night. He wanted to demand why a man named Julian was threatening his position at Pemberton Tech. But the cold logic that governed his professional life kicked in, freezing the rage in his throat. If he confronted her now, blind to the full scope of Julian's leverage, he risked detonating a bomb that could destroy everything: his daughter's future, his career, their financial security. "Just a headache," Daniel lied, forcing a tight, unconvincing smile. "Work was stressful yesterday. I'll be fine." Evelyn offered a sympathetic nod, pouring her own coffee. "Try to get some rest tonight. You push yourself too hard." She turned her back to him, reaching for her phone. Daniel watched her thumbs fly across the screen, a cold realization settling deep in his chest. He wasn't just a betrayed husband anymore. He was a man standing in a minefield, and the woman who had planted the explosives was currently asking him if he wanted sugar in his tea. He needed to know exactly who Julian St. James was, and more importantly, what he held over the Foster family. The glass walls of Daniel's corner office at Pemberton Tech offered a sweeping, panoramic view of the Bellevue skyline, now shrouded in a thick, unyielding gray fog. Usually, the height and the sterile, quiet environment of the executive floor helped him think clearly. Today, the silence was deafening, a vacuum that sucked the air from his lungs. On his primary monitor, lines of complex predictive algorithms ran their usual diagnostics. On his secondary monitor, masked by a heavy VPN and layered routing protocols, was the digital footprint of a man named Julian St. James. Daniel had always been a master of systems. He understood inputs, variables, and unavoidable outcomes. Now he was applying that same cold, relentless logic to the autopsy of his marriage. If Julian had the power to threaten his position at Pemberton Tech, Daniel needed to know exactly who was sitting on the other side of the chessboard. His fingers flew across the mechanical keyboard, bypassing standard search engines to dive into property records, corporate registries, and archived press releases. Julian was not a shadow, he was a monument. He was the founder of St. James Holdings, a luxury real estate development firm with a portfolio that spanned the Pacific Northwest. There were photos of him cutting ribbons at luxury high-rises, his smile sharp, his eyes calculating. He possessed the arrogant posture of a man who believed the world was an asset waiting to be acquired. Then Daniel found her, Samantha Gray. Julian's wife was the epitome of inherited wealth and quiet philanthropy. The screen filled with images of Samantha hosting charity galas for the Seattle Symphony, her blonde hair perfectly coiffed, her smile warm but distinctly guarded. She looked immaculate. She looked like a woman who had everything, married to a man who still wanted more. Daniel stared at Samantha's digital presence, a bitter metallic taste rising in his throat. Why would a man with a woman like that risk everything for Evelyn? But as Daniel cross-referenced Julian's corporate acquisitions, the answer began to form, sickening and clear. It wasn't just about lust, it was about leverage. Julian was a predator who thrived on control. He didn't just sleep with women, he acquired them. And through Evelyn, he had somehow acquired a back door into Daniel's life. Daniel's mind raced back to the long nights he had worked from his home study, leaving sensitive Pemberton tech files open on his desk while he went to make coffee. Had Evelyn photographed them? Had she unknowingly handed Julian the exact ammunition he needed to hold a knife to Daniel's throat? The thought made Daniel physically nauseous. He minimized the windows and pulled up a proprietary architectural database, entering the single location mentioned in the encrypted emails, the Meridian. The system processed the query. The Meridian was a crown jewel in St. James Holdings' portfolio, a 40-story monolith of glass and steel in downtown Seattle, boasting biometric security and private elevators. It was a fortress. And somewhere inside that fortress, Julian had a room where he systematically dismantled Daniel's wife. A sudden chime from his calendar broke his trance. It was a synchronized alert from Evelyn's shared iCloud schedule. Thursday, 1 p.m., client lunch at Harborview Restaurant. Daniel leaned back in his ergonomic chair, his eyes fixed on the calendar notification. The encrypted emails had mentioned a public meeting to discuss the files before their private session. The variables were finally aligning. He was no longer just an observer watching his life burn down. He was the architect of the response. He reached over and quietly canceled his Thursday afternoon budget meeting. The rain had paused by noon, leaving the Seattle waterfront draped in a heavy, salt-tinged mist. Harborview Restaurant sat at the edge of the pier, its expansive floor-to-ceiling glass offering an unobstructed, melancholic view of the Gray Puget Sound. Daniel Foster sat in a rented sedan 2 rows back in the valet lot. The engine off, the windows cracked just enough to let in the damp, freezing chill. At 12:55 p.m., Evelyn's black SUV pulled into the lot. She stepped out, wearing a tailored charcoal trench coat, her posture noticeably stiff. Daniel raised his binoculars, a bitter taste flooding his mouth. He had bought her that coat for their 5th anniversary in Paris. Now, it was armor for a rendezvous with a blackmailer. She walked into the restaurant. Daniel waited 3 agonizing minutes before slipping out of the car. He didn't enter the main dining room. Instead, he took a seat at the dimly lit bar area, positioned perfectly behind a decorative frosted glass partition that gave him a clear, fragmented line of sight to the secluded corner booth Evelyn had taken. 10 minutes later, Julian St. James arrived. Julian moved with the languid, terrifying grace of an apex predator inspecting its territory. He wore a navy bespoke suit that caught the ambient light, his silver-flecked hair perfectly styled against the damp weather. When he slid into the booth across from Evelyn, he didn't lean in for a kiss. He didn't reach for her hand with the desperate longing of a secret lover. Instead, he leaned back, steepling his fingers, his eyes locked on her with a cold, clinical amusement. Through the frosted glass, Daniel watched the woman he had loved for 7 years shrink into the leather upholstery. Evelyn's elegant, unshakable facade, the one she maintained so effortlessly at home and at her gallery, was entirely gone. Her shoulders were hunched, her hands tightly gripping a glass of ice water. She wasn't blushing. She was terrified. Julian leaned forward then, his demeanor shifting from relaxed to intensely focused. He reached inside his breast pocket and pulled out a sleek white envelope, sliding it slowly across the linen tablecloth. Evelyn stared at it as if it were a coiled snake. When she finally reached out to touch it, Daniel saw her hand trembling so violently that her diamond wedding band caught the overhead light in a frantic, shaking rhythm. Daniel's chest tightened, the air abandoning his lungs. The pure, unadulterated rage that had been boiling inside him since Tuesday night suddenly fractured, giving way to a sickening wave of comprehension. This wasn't a romantic lunch. This was an extortion. Julian was dictating terms, and Evelyn was suffocating under their weight. Julian reached across the table, his large hand enveloping Evelyn's shaking fingers. To the casual observer across the restaurant, it looked like an intimate gesture of reassurance. But Daniel saw Evelyn flinch. He saw the subtle, desperate attempt to pull her hand back, and the bruising, immediate tightening of Julian's grip. Julian said something, his lips barely moving, a handsome smile painted on his face that never once reached his dead eyes. A violent, primal instinct flared in Daniel's gut. He wanted to cross the room, shatter a bottle of wine over Julian's perfect jaw, and drag his wife out of that booth. But the cold, analytical architect inside him slammed the brakes. If he walked over there now, Julian would simply smile, pick up his phone, and send whatever he had in that envelope to the Pemberton Tech Board. Daniel would lose his job, his reputation, and his financial leverage, all in one blind moment of masculine pride. He had to watch. He had to endure the sight of his wife being dismantled by the man she had chosen over him. Evelyn closed her eyes and nodded once, a sharp, utterly defeated motion. Julian released her hand, tossed $100 bill onto the table, and stood up. He walked out of the restaurant without looking back, merging seamlessly into the wealthy lunchtime crowd. Evelyn remained in the booth, staring blankly at the white envelope, looking completely hollowed out. Daniel sat in the shadows of the bar, the ice melting in his untouched drink. The parameters of the game had officially changed. Evelyn was guilty of the affair, but she was no longer just a cheating wife. She was the bait, and Daniel was the prey. The muffled, steady drumming of water against the glass tiles of the master bathroom provided a fragile acoustic cover. It was 9 p.m. Daniel stood in the center of their softly lit bedroom, listening to the shower running. Evelyn had come home from the client lunch claiming exhaustion, her face pale, her movements stiff and guarded. She had left her black leather Bottega Veneta tote resting carelessly on the velvet armchair near the window. For 7 years, Daniel had never once looked inside her purse. It was an unspoken sanctuary of privacy, a boundary he had always respected with absolute devotion. But the man who respected boundaries had died on Tuesday night in front of a glowing MacBook screen. He approached the armchair, his heart hammering a violent, erratic rhythm against his ribs. The steam from the bathroom was beginning to drift under the doorframe, carrying the familiar, agonizing scent of her jasmine body wash. He had only a few minutes. Daniel carefully unzipped the tote, his eyes meticulously memorizing the exact position of the gold zipper pull. His fingers bypassed her oversized sunglasses, a compact mirror, and her heavy leather wallet. He was looking for the white envelope Julian had slid across the table at Harborview. Instead, his hand brushed against the cool, smooth fabric of a hidden interior pocket. It was zipped shut. He opened it. Inside, there was no envelope. There was only a single, heavy object. Daniel pulled it out and held it under the soft, warm glow of the bedside lamp. It was an unmarked silver key. It didn't look like a standard house key. It was thick, modern, and geometrically complex, featuring a series of intricate dimples rather than traditional jagged teeth. It was a high-security Medeco lock key, the exact type used as a manual failsafe in ultra-luxury smart buildings. Buildings like the Meridian, the cold metal seemed to burn into his palm. This was the physical manifestation of her betrayal. This was the passport to the room where she stripped off her marriage and became Julian St. James's property. Daniel stared at the silver object, a suffocating wave of nausea washing over him. He imagined the heavy mahogany door it opened, the expensive sheets, the whispers exchanged in the aftermath of their ruined vows. Suddenly, the sound of the running water in the bathroom abruptly stopped. The silence that followed was deafening. Panic, cold and sharp, spiked in Daniel's veins. He heard the faint squeak of the glass shower door sliding open. She would be reaching for her towel. In less than 60 seconds, she would walk out into the bedroom. His analytical mind, forged in the high-stakes environment of Pemberton Tech, instantly took over the paralyzing fear. He pulled out his phone, turned off the flash, and snapped 3 high-resolution macro photographs of the key, capturing the intricate dimple cuts in the serial number faintly engraved on the neck. It would be enough for a specialized, discreet locksmith to replicate. With trembling hands, Daniel slipped the silver key back into the hidden pocket. He zipped it exactly halfway, matching the precise position he had found it in. He returned the main zipper of the tote to its original spot, adjusting the leather straps so they draped identically over the armrest. He stepped away from the chair just as the bathroom doorknob turned. Evelyn emerged wrapped in a plush white towel, her dark hair damp and clinging to her collarbones. The steam billowed out behind her, a cinematic framing of a woman who looked simultaneously pure and entirely corrupted. She stopped dead in her tracks, her eyes finding him standing near the edge of the bed. For a microsecond, a flash of pure paranoia crossed her features. "Did you need something in the bathroom?" she asked, her voice tight, attempting a casual tone that fell tragically short. "No," Daniel replied, his voice terrifyingly calm, the digital imprint of her secret key safely stored in his pocket. "Just waiting for you." She offered a small, fractured smile and turned toward her vanity. Daniel watched her in the mirror, realizing that the silver key hadn't just unlocked a door at the Meridian. It had unlocked the absolute certainty that he was going to burn her secret world to the ground. The duplicated Medico key felt heavy and jagged in Daniel's palm. The discreet locksmith in Pioneer Square had charged an exorbitant fee for the rush job, but as the heavy mahogany door of Penthouse 40B at the Meridian clicked open, Daniel knew it was worth every cent. It was Friday afternoon. Evelyn was allegedly at a gallery opening downtown, and his digital tracking confirmed Julian was boarding a brief flight to Portland. The apartment was entirely empty. Daniel stepped inside, the heavy door sealing shut behind him with a suffocating airtight thud. The silence of the 40-story elevation was absolute, isolating the penthouse from the vibrant pulse of Seattle below. The space was a monument to clinical, intimidating wealth: polished concrete floors, minimalist Italian leather furniture, and floor-to-ceiling windows that offered a dizzying gray view of the Puget Sound. But it wasn't the architecture that made Daniel's lungs seize. It was the air. The atmosphere was thick with a scent that struck him with the force of a physical blow. It was the unmistakable, delicate fragrance of Evelyn's jasmine perfume, inextricably woven into the heavy, smoky notes of an expensive oud wood cologne. It was the scent of their intimacy, suspended in the climate-controlled air. Daniel closed his eyes, his hands balling into fists as a violent wave of nausea washed over him. He was standing in the very epicenter of his wife's secret life. He moved through the living room like a ghost trespassing in a graveyard. On the pristine marble kitchen island sat 2 crystal wine glasses, a dark rim of Merlot still clinging to the bottom of one. He stared at the faint smudge of Evelyn's signature plum lipstick on the rim. It was a visceral, undeniable proof of life, of their life. The hallway led to the master bedroom. Daniel hesitated, his hand resting on the cool metal of the door handle. Opening it meant crossing the final threshold, stepping into the absolute destruction of his marriage. He pushed it open. The bed was a sprawling landscape of dark silk sheets, unmade and tangled. The pillows still bore the deep indentations of 2 bodies. Draped carelessly over the back of a modern velvet chair was a familiar silk scarf, the exact one Daniel had bought her in Milan 3 years ago. Seeing it there, discarded in another man's bedroom, fractured something deep and foundational within his chest. The analytical, composed executive from Pemberton Tech vanished, leaving only a profoundly broken man. He sank onto the edge of the mattress, burying his face in his hands. The pain was no longer a dull, distant ache. It was a sharp, jagged piece of glass turning in his chest. He wanted to scream. He wanted to tear the silk sheets to shreds and shatter the floor-to-ceiling glass. But as he raised his head, his tear-filled eyes caught sight of something metallic glinting behind a slightly askew abstract painting on the far wall. Daniel stood up, his breathing ragged, and approached the canvas. He carefully pushed it aside. A biometric wall safe was seamlessly embedded in the drywall. The white envelope, the leverage, the weapon Julian was using to hold his wife hostage and threaten his life's work. It was in there. Daniel couldn't open it, not without Julian's fingerprint or a blowtorch, but he finally knew where the monster kept its teeth. The crushing weight of sorrow began to harden, cooling into a sharp, diamond-hard resolve. The time for lurking in the shadows, for passive observation and silent suffering, was over. He carefully adjusted the painting, ensuring it hung exactly as he had found it. He smoothed out the carpet where he had stepped, walking out of the bedroom and out of the penthouse. As he locked the heavy mahogany door behind him, Daniel knew exactly what he had to do. The charade ended tonight. The grandfather clock in the foyer ticked with a slow, heavy rhythm, each metallic heartbeat amplifying the suffocating silence of the Bellevue estate. It was 8:15 p.m. Daniel sat at the head of the long mahogany dining table, the room deliberately submerged in shadows save for the single, unforgiving pendant light illuminating the surface directly before him. Arranged with the meticulous, detached precision of an autopsy, the evidence lay waiting. A thick stack of printer paper, 72 pages of decrypted emails between E.Brooks.Private and J, sat perfectly squared on the polished wood. Beside the stack, gleaming with a cold, accusatory light, rested the duplicated silver Medico key. The heavy front door clicked open, followed by the familiar rustle of a damp trench coat being hung in the hall closet. The soft, rhythmic tapping of Evelyn's designer heels echoed across the hardwood floor, growing louder as she approached. "Dan, are you home?" Her voice was light, carrying the practiced, breezy fatigue of a successful woman returning from a long day. The gallery opening was exhausting. "I think I'm just going to pour a glass of—" She stopped in the arched doorway of the dining room. The words died instantly in her throat. Daniel did not move. He sat completely still, his hands folded evenly in his lap, his eyes locked onto her face. He watched as her gaze drifted from his stoic, shadowed expression to the harsh pool of light on the table. He watched her eyes register the thick stack of paper. Then he watched them snap toward the metallic shine of the silver key. The physical transformation was instantaneous and brutal. The elegant, poised art curator vanished. In her place stood a woman who had just stepped off a cliff in the dark. The color drained from her face so rapidly that her skin took on a sickly, translucent pallor. Her breath hitched, a sharp, ragged intake of air that sounded like tearing silk. The heavy Bottega Veneta tote slipped from her trembling fingers, hitting the floor with a dull, heavy thud that reverberated through the silent house. "Daniel," she whispered. It wasn't a question. It was a breathless, hollow plea. "Sit down, Evelyn," Daniel said. His voice was unrecognizable even to himself. A flat, deadened frequency entirely devoid of warmth, anger, or mercy. She didn't move. She couldn't. Her legs seemed to have lost their structural integrity. She braced a shaking hand against the doorframe, her knuckles turning bone white. Her eyes darted wildly between his face and the table, desperately searching for an exit from a nightmare that was rapidly solidifying into reality. "I said sit down," he repeated, the cold clinical authority in his tone slicing through her rising panic. Slowly, unsteadily, as if navigating a minefield in the dark, she moved toward the chair opposite him and collapsed into it. She didn't look at the papers. She couldn't tear her eyes away from the Medico key. 72 pages, Daniel stated, breaking the agonizing silence. He reached out and tapped the stack of emails with one index finger. 8 months of hotel logs, stolen afternoons, and explicit promises. And this, he picked up the silver key, letting it catch the overhead light. Penthouse 40B at the Meridian. The lock was quite sophisticated. The scent of your perfume in his sheets, however, was not. A visceral, agonizing sob ripped its way out of Evelyn's chest. It was an ugly, guttural sound, stripping away all of her carefully curated edges. She buried her face in her hands, her shoulders shaking violently as the dam finally broke. The tears weren't just a physical reaction. They were the absolute, catastrophic collapse of the wall she had built around her dual lives. Daniel watched her weep. A part of him, the ghost of the man who had loved her for 7 years, wanted to cross the room and pull her into his arms, to blindly promise they could fix the unfixable. But that man was suffocating under the crushing weight of her betrayal. He felt nothing but a cold, terrifying detachment. "Why?" Daniel asked, the single word hanging in the air like a guillotine blade waiting to drop. "Why him, Evelyn?" She kept her face hidden, her heavy, wet cries echoing off the high ceilings of the room they had decorated together. The confrontation had arrived, but as Daniel watched his wife shatter into pieces, he braced himself. He knew the debris of their marriage was about to reveal something far more dangerous than a broken vow. The heavy, suffocating sound of Evelyn's weeping filled the dining room, echoing off the mahogany walls. Daniel sat motionless, a statue carved from ice, watching the woman he loved dismantle herself. He had expected a litany of tired excuses, boredom, loneliness, a momentary lapse of judgment. He waited for the classic narrative of a neglected wife seeking validation in the arms of a charismatic stranger. "I made a mistake, Dan," she finally choked out, her voice barely a whisper, ravaged by her sobs. She kept her face buried in her hands, unable to meet his deadened gaze. "In the beginning, it was just a mistake. A stupid, reckless mistake after the gallery gala." "A mistake," Daniel repeated, the word tasting like venom on his tongue. "You made a mistake for 8 months? You kept a Medico key in your purse to maintain this mistake?" At that, Evelyn slowly lowered her hands. The tears streaming down her pale cheeks seemed to freeze. The desperate, pleading sorrow that had contorted her features just seconds ago vanished, replaced by a stark, terrifying emptiness. She looked at him with hollow, bloodshot eyes, and the sheer terror radiating from her suddenly made Daniel's pulse stutter. "I didn't want the key, Daniel," she whispered, her voice eerily calm, stripped of all emotion. "Julian gave it to me, and I couldn't stop going. If I stopped, he promised he would destroy you." The air in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. Daniel's brow furrowed, his analytical mind struggling to process the sudden, jarring shift in the narrative. "What are you talking about?" Evelyn leaned forward, her trembling hands gripping the edge of the mahogany table as if to anchor herself to reality. "You saw us at Harborview yesterday. I know you did. I saw your car in the reflection of the glass when I was walking out." Daniel didn't confirm or deny it. He just stared, the hairs on the back of his neck standing up. "The envelope he gave me," she continued, her breathing shallow and rapid. "It wasn't a love letter. It was a printed copy of the proprietary source code for Pemberton Tech's upcoming government contract, the defense project you've been leading for the past 2 years. Daniel felt the blood drain from his face. The breath left his lungs in a sharp, painful rush, leaving him entirely hollowed out. "How?" he started, his voice cracking under the sudden, immense weight of the revelation. "My phone," she confessed, a fresh tear slipping down her cheek. "4 months ago, while you were asleep, he made me unlock your home office laptop. He walked me through the firewall bypass over a secure line. I didn't know what I was copying, Dan. I swear to God, I didn't understand the technical files. He said it was just financial leverage for a real estate bid, but it was everything." The pieces of the puzzle slammed together with sickening, catastrophic force. Julian St. James wasn't a man obsessed with Evelyn Foster. He was a corporate predator who had found a beautiful, vulnerable backdoor into Pemberton Tech. "He told me," Evelyn whispered, her voice breaking into a fractured sob, "that if I stopped seeing him, or if I ever told you the truth, he would leak the code to your biggest competitors and send the encrypted audit trails to your board. You would be fired, sued into bankruptcy, and possibly face federal charges for corporate espionage." Daniel looked down at the 72 pages of printed emails. They weren't just a chronicle of infidelity anymore. They were the digital chains of a hostage situation, the searing, blinding rage of a betrayed husband abruptly dissolved, leaving behind the cold, calculating dread of a man standing on the trapdoor of a gallows. He raised his eyes to look at his wife. She wasn't just a cheater, she was the bait. And they were both caught in the trap. The mahogany dining table, previously the stage for a domestic tragedy, had suddenly transformed into a war room. The silence that followed Evelyn's confession was no longer the heavy, suffocating quiet of a broken marriage. It was the sharp, ringing vacuum of a detonated bomb. Daniel stared at the 72 pages of printed emails, his mind rapidly recalibrating the threat level. The sting of infidelity was a profound, localized pain. The theft of Pemberton Tech's proprietary source code for a classified defense contract was total annihilation. 4 months ago, Daniel said, his voice dropping an octave, entirely devoid of the earlier trembling rage. He was now operating purely on the cold, executive logic that had built his career. The week of the alpha phase testing. I worked 70 hours. I came home on a Thursday and took an Ambien. Evelyn nodded slowly, her face pale and drawn, her shoulders hunched as if expecting a physical blow. He knew your schedule. I had told him how stressed you were, how you were bringing the classified drives home to finalize the architecture. He called me at 1 in the morning. He said he needed a favor, just a small advantage over a competitor for a city zoning contract. Daniel closed his eyes, a wave of profound nausea washing over him. He remembered that night. He remembered the heavy chemical sleep that had pulled him under, leaving his encrypted laptop resting on his oak desk downstairs, connected to the secure home network. He had trusted the impenetrable perimeter of his own house. He had trusted his wife. He stayed on the phone with me, she continued, her voice a fragile, raspy thread. He walked me through the directory. I didn't understand the file extensions, Dan. He told me exactly what to compress, what to send to an encrypted server drop. When I asked why the files looked so complex, his voice changed. The charm just vanished. He told me that if I stopped the transfer, he would send the hotel security footage of us to you immediately. She looked up, her bloodshot eyes pleading for a sliver of understanding, if not forgiveness. I was terrified of losing you. I thought I was protecting our family by giving him some meaningless financial data. But the next day he met me at the Meridian. He showed me what I had actually stolen. He showed me the federal penal codes for corporate espionage. He said he owned me now. He owned both of us. Daniel stood up, the legs of his chair scraping harshly against the hardwood floor. He walked over to the floor-to-ceiling window, staring out at the rain-slicked driveway of the life they had built together. The bitter irony tasted like ash in his mouth. Julian St. James hadn't just seduced a bored, lonely wife. He had executed a masterclass in corporate infiltration, using Evelyn's guilt and vanity as a Trojan horse. Does he have the physical drives? Daniel asked, turning back to face her. The emotional architecture of their relationship was completely shattered, but a cold, pragmatic alliance was rapidly forming in its ruins. No, Evelyn whispered, wiping her face with the back of her trembling hand. He has a physical hard copy of the core algorithm and a flash drive with the digital signature. He keeps them in the wall safe at the penthouse. He showed them to me yesterday at Harborview to prove he wasn't bluffing about the deadline. He wants the final deployment protocols by Monday, or he goes to the board. Daniel reached into his pocket and pulled out his phone. He opened the photo gallery and brought up the 3 macro images of the silver Medeco key. He then looked at the woman sitting at his table, the woman who had betrayed his bed and endangered his freedom. The love he had harbored for her was gone, replaced by a terrifying absolute clarity. They were no longer husband and wife. They were accomplices. The biometric safe behind the abstract painting in the master bedroom, Daniel stated flatly. Evelyn's head snapped up, a flicker of genuine shock momentarily cutting through her despair. How do you know about the safe? Because I was in his apartment this afternoon, Daniel replied, pocketing his phone. Dry your tears, Evelyn. The Grieving Widow Act ends tonight. We have 3 days to steal my life back. By 3 a.m. on Saturday, the 72 pages of illicit emails had been swept aside. In their place, illuminated by the harsh dining room pendant light, lay a crude, hand-drawn floor plan of Penthouse 40B. Daniel had sketched it from memory, his architectural precision rendering the luxury apartment into a tactical kill zone. Evelyn sat across from him, wrapped in a heavy wool cardigan, shivering despite the central heating. The domestic warmth of their home had been entirely replaced by the clinical, freezing atmosphere of a war room. The safe is biometric, Daniel stated, his voice a low, mechanical monotone. He tapped the tip of his pen against the master bedroom on the sketch. It requires a live thumbprint. I can bypass the digital firewalls at Pemberton Tech, but I cannot fake human thermodynamics to trick a high-end capacitance scanner. We need his hand. Evelyn swallowed hard, her eyes fixed on the drawing. Julian lands at SeaTac at 5 this evening. He texted me before his flight left Portland. He expects me at the Meridian by 7 to deliver the final deployment protocols. Then you will deliver them, Daniel said smoothly. He reached into his pocket and placed a sleek, silver flash drive on the mahogany table. This contains a fragmented, looped algorithm. It will look like the core code to a layman, but it's completely useless. It will buy us exactly 5 minutes. He reached into his pocket again. This time he withdrew a tiny clear glass vial. Inside was a fine, chalky white powder. He slid it across the polished wood until it rested inches from Evelyn's trembling fingers. She stared at it, her breath hitching. "What is that?" "3 of my prescription Ambien, crushed," Daniel replied, his gaze unwavering. "You mentioned he likes to pour a glass of Macallan 18 as soon as you arrive. You will offer to pour it tonight. You empty this vial into his glass. It is water-soluble and virtually tasteless in heavy scotch. Within 20 minutes, he will experience severe ataxia, followed by deep, unarousable sedation." Evelyn's hand hovered over the vial. The reality of what he was asking her to do was settling over her like a suffocating blanket. She wasn't just ending an affair. She was executing a premeditated assault on a powerful, dangerous man. "I'll be waiting in the emergency stairwell on the 40th floor," Daniel continued, outlining the choreography of their survival. "When he loses consciousness, you text me a single period. I use the Medico key to enter. We drag him to the bedroom, use his thumb to open the safe, retrieve the proprietary drives, and leave the silver flash drive in their place. By the time he wakes up tomorrow morning, the physical evidence is ash, and the digital trail is erased from his local server." "Dan," Evelyn whispered, her voice cracking under the immense, crushing weight of the plan. "What if he doesn't drink it right away? What if he wants to take me to the bedroom first?" The silence that followed her question was brutal. It stretched between them, thick with the ghosts of the intimacy she had surrendered to another man. Daniel looked at his wife, the elegant art curator, the mother of his child, the architect of his current hell. He felt no jealousy anymore. The wound had been cauterized by necessity. "Then you do whatever it takes to get him back to that glass, Evelyn," Daniel said, his voice entirely deadened, devoid of any husbandly instinct to protect her honor. "Your dignity was spent months ago in those sheets. Tonight, we are buying back my life, and you are going to pay the toll." A fresh tear spilled over Evelyn's lower lash line, tracing a pale path down her cheek, but she didn't argue. The truth was an absolute, unforgiving blade. She reached out, her fingers closing tightly around the glass vial of crushed pills. "I'll do it," she breathed, the words a hollow surrender. Daniel nodded once, a sharp, business-like motion. He didn't trust her loyalty, and he didn't trust her love. But as he looked into her terrified eyes, he trusted her fear. Julian St. James had made a critical miscalculation. He had backed a desperate man into a corner, and he had forgotten that trapped animals do not negotiate. They bite. The concrete emergency stairwell of the Meridian was a freezing, windowless, vertical tunnel. At 7:42 p.m., Daniel stood on the 40th floor landing, staring at the glowing face of his phone. Every passing second felt like a physical weight pressing against his chest, restricting his breathing. If Evelyn failed, if her nerve broke, if her hands shook too violently, or if Julian noticed the chalky residue in his heavy scotch, Daniel's entire existence would be erased by morning. He waited in the absolute silence, his thumb hovering over the screen. Then it vibrated, a single text message from Evelyn. Daniel moved. He slipped out of the stairwell and walked swiftly down the carpeted corridor to penthouse 40B. The duplicated Medico key slid smoothly into the complex lock. With a heavy metallic click, the mahogany door yielded. Inside, the penthouse was dimly lit, bathed in the amber glow of city lights filtering through the floor-to-ceiling windows. Soft jazz played from a hidden sound system. The air was thick with the suffocating, interwoven scents of expensive Macallan, oud wood, and Evelyn's jasmine perfume. Julian St. James was slumped sideways on the plush Italian leather sofa. His head was thrown back at an unnatural angle, his mouth slightly open, his chest rising and falling in the deep, shallow rhythm of a chemically induced coma. The crystal glass lay tipped over on the rug, a dark stain of scotch spreading across the wool fibers. Evelyn stood near the kitchen island, trembling so violently she had to grip the marble countertop to stay upright. Her face was entirely drained of color, her eyes wide with a paralyzing mix of terror and shattered relief. Daniel didn't speak. The time for words had expired. He moved with the cold, surgical precision of a machine. He grabbed Julian by the lapels of his bespoke navy suit. The man was dead weight, his muscles completely flaccid. "Help me!" Daniel hissed, his voice a harsh, commanding whisper. Evelyn stumbled forward. Together, the betrayed husband and the cheating wife grabbed the arms of the blackmailer, dragging his heavy, unconscious body across the polished concrete floor. They hauled him down the hallway and into the master bedroom, the very room that had served as the graveyard for their marriage vows. They dropped Julian near the wall. Daniel shoved the abstract canvas aside, exposing the steel face of the biometric safe. He grabbed Julian's limp right hand. The skin was warm, the fingers thick and heavy. Daniel pressed Julian's thumb firmly against the glowing green glass of the scanner, holding his breath as the system processed the thermal and ridge data. A low mechanical whir, a sharp click. The heavy steel door popped open. Inside the dark cavity sat a thick manila envelope and a black encrypted flash drive. Daniel pulled them out, his eyes scanning the visible Pemberton Tech watermarks on the top page of the code. It was all there. The leverage, the gun to his head. He quickly reached into his coat pocket, took out the decoy silver flash drive he had engineered, and tossed it into the empty safe. He slammed the steel door shut and pulled the painting back into perfect alignment. It was over. Daniel stood up, the manila envelope clutched tightly in his hand. The threat was entirely neutralized. He had secured his future at Pemberton Tech, protected his family's assets, and avoided federal prison. The adrenaline that had sustained him for the past 48 hours began to rapidly drain from his bloodstream. But as the chemical rush faded, it left a profound, echoing vacuum in its wake. He looked down at the unconscious man on the floor, and then he looked at his wife. Evelyn was weeping silently, her hands covering her mouth, waiting for a word of comfort, a sign that surviving this nightmare meant they could finally begin to heal. Daniel felt nothing, no anger, no triumph, no love. He was standing in the bedroom where his wife had surrendered herself, holding the stolen remnants of his life's work. Victory tasted exactly like ash. He walked past her toward the doorway, not stopping to offer a comforting touch. "Grab your coat," Daniel said, his voice a dead, emotionless echo in the dark room. "We're leaving." The rain had returned to Seattle, a familiar, rhythmic drumming against the tempered glass of the conference room on the 32nd floor of Bennett and Hayes. It had been exactly 3 weeks since the night at the Meridian. 3 weeks since Julian St. James woke up with a chemical hangover to a perfectly staged apartment and a useless string of decoy code in his biometric safe. Realizing his leverage had evaporated into the damp city air, the predator had quietly retreated into the shadows. Mutually assured destruction was no longer an option when he had nothing left to hold over them. Daniel Foster sat at the polished oak table, his posture rigidly straight. The physical threat to his career at Pemberton Tech was completely neutralized. His professional reputation remained immaculate, and his family's assets were safe from federal seizure. He had successfully protected his daughter's future and won the war against an extortionist. But as he looked across the expanse of the conference table at the woman sitting opposite him, the victory tasted like dust. Evelyn looked incredibly fragile, her frame seemingly swallowed by the oversized lapels of her charcoal trench coat. The meticulously curated veneer she had maintained for 7 years was entirely gone, replaced by a quiet, profound exhaustion. They had spent the last 21 days living in the Bellevue estate like ghosts haunting the same graveyard, speaking only in hushed, logistical terms about their daughter. Between them, resting on the smooth wood, lay a thick stack of legal documents. They were not encrypted emails or stolen source codes. They were the final, irrevocable terms of their divorce. The silence in the room was suffocating, broken only by the soft scratching of their respective attorneys turning pages. There was no anger left in Daniel's chest. The explosive rage of the discovery and the cold adrenaline of the heist had burned out, leaving nothing but a vast expanse of grief. They had allied to survive a monster, but the alliance had required them to look at the darkest, most ruined parts of each other. Daniel had seen Evelyn's absolute moral collapse, and she had seen the terrifying, emotionless machine he could become. You cannot unsee the wreckage. Daniel picked up the heavy silver Mont Blanc pen. He stared at the blue sticky flag pointing to the signature line. This was the physical end of the narrative they had built together, the end of the shared coffee in the kitchen, the quiet pride he used to feel when she walked into a room. He signed his name, the black ink flowing smoothly across the page, a clinical execution of their marriage. He slid the papers across the table. Evelyn stared down at the document. Her hands trembled, a heartbreaking echo of the terror she had displayed when Julian first handed her the blackmail envelope. But this time she wasn't trapped by a predator. She was trapped by the inescapable consequences of her own choices. She picked up her pen, her knuckles turning bone white. She slowly lowered the tip to the paper. As she traced the first letter of her name, a single heavy tear escaped her eyelashes. It fell, landing with a soft splash right over the printed word, Foster, blurring the ink of the name she was surrendering forever. She didn't wipe it away. She finished signing, the jagged strokes a stark contrast to her usual elegant script. Evelyn looked up, her hollow eyes meeting Daniel's. The shared trauma of what they had done, the theft, the drugging, the desperate survival, hung heavily between them. It was a toxic bond that paradoxically meant they could never be together again. She offered a small, tragic smile, entirely devoid of hope. "We survived the storm, Daniel," she whispered, her voice barely carrying over the sound of the rain lashing against the window pane. "But the rain washed away whatever was left of us." Daniel looked at her, silently acknowledging the absolute truth of her words. He stood up, buttoned his suit jacket, and walked out of the conference room without looking back, leaving the tear-stained papers and the ruins of his life on the table.